The LA-2A is one of the most highly regarded compressors in history. In fact, if I were to name one compressor used on more hit vocals than any other, it would be the LA-2A, and specifically the Universal Audio LA-2A plugin, which I happen to have here. This is a deceptively simple unit. It primarily focuses around a single control, which is the peak reduction. However, the behavior of the unit is extremely nonlinear. So depending on the program material, we get very different responses. So I want to take a little look here at the LA-2A on some different sources and how to set it in ways to get the musical response that it is famous for. I'm going to start here on bass. LA-2A is a classic plugin for bass, and in this particular example, we will be using upright bass. So I'm going to give a little play down here with just the track and focus on the upright. So you notice as soon as I engage the LA-2A, the bass sound just springs to life. No EQ, no additional effects, saturation, nothing like that, just the compression. So what are we doing here? What are some of our considerations? Well, we start with the peak reduction control, but we have to understand that the way that the signal is feeding the compressor will affect the performance and especially the time constants. So a typical starting place for an LA-2A is where it defaults to, which is right around the 30 peak reduction and the 30 makeup gain. Of course, this is going to depend on how hot our signal is coming in, but really what's important is the amount of gain reduction we are doing. So for a typical signal that is not already heavily compressed, if we're operating between about -2 and -5 on our VU meter, that's usually considered the standard range. The reason for this, however, isn't because of the numbers. We're not playing mix by numbers. What we're doing is listening for the action of the compressor, which will change even within this particular range, depending on what we are feeding it. However, because we are doing a lighter amount of compression, a light to moderate amount of compression, the attack times are going to stay within their slower range. This is going to give us something that is both controlled but also fairly punchy. So that's why this is considered generally a good default position. All of our notes are very even, the sustain and body has come up a little bit, and we're still getting a good, healthy, round punch from our upright. Now, what I'm going to start doing is pushing the peak reduction here, and this is going to change not only the amount of compression being done, but the actual action of the compression as well. Even before applying the makeup gain, you probably heard some difference in the tone and attack. The attack has become much thinner and spikier, and the tone is becoming much flatter and warmer. This is because the compressor is now starting to behave more like a limiter. Our attack times and our release times have become much faster, so we're getting a lot more sustain and body and a lot less attack. I'm going to now apply makeup gain here. And let's pull it into the track so we can hear the difference in the record itself. So this is with the heavy compression. We're getting a very dark sound. We're also getting a lot of the string noises in the release, all of those kind of rubbery doing-doings, you know, that fun stuff that lets us know we are playing an upright bass here. Let's go back to where we were before with our 30 peak reduction and our lower makeup gain. We're getting a much more natural response here. We're also getting a slightly brighter tone compared to what we had before. We always have to check in the mix to determine what is going to be better. In this particular case, I prefer the lighter peak reduction with less of the makeup gain. While I do like that the heavier sound that weights more toward the deeper part of the bass is present in the heavy peak reduction, I feel like we're losing some of the musicality, and so I think that the punchier, more dynamic, kind of more natural sound is working better for this record. However, this happens to be an upright bass in sort of like a vintagey, vibey, throwback style hip-hop type record. You might be doing something where you're playing a heavy rock tune where the desire for the bass is to really just hold down this very, very heavy low end, in which case, really just pushing the peak reduction and nailing the compressor might be the best sound. Now, I want to show one other technique for bass. So the emphasis is the detector feeding, or the sidechain feeding the detector. We can bring more low end out by turning this little screw right here, this plus HF minus, to the left. So if I start doing that, you'll notice that the amount of compression will start going down. This is because I'm using a bass and I'm pulling bass out of the detector circuit, right? So obviously we're getting less to the detector circuit, therefore less compression. So let me switch over here where I've pulled out a ton of bass, but now I've pushed the peak reduction up so that we're going to ultimately end up getting around the same amount of gain reduction we were getting before, but the LA-2A is now responding to upper frequencies a lot more than it's responding to the bass, and it sounds like this. If I pop back over to before and I set the settings where they were, which is around here, we notice that the upright bass is a lot bigger and more upfront. However, there's a warm sort of vintagey vibe that we can get by pulling out the lows and having the LA-2A react to just the highs in a bass. It's a really good way of doing R&B bass, Motown bass, anything where you want that kind of warmer, fuzzier, cushionier sound. I really like this technique, and I think in this particular record it's actually working quite well, although I do think I need to push the makeup gain a little bit more. That just sounds like a dream. I love that. This is definitely the sound for this record. This is what I'm going to keep. Now, I do want to also point out that if you happen to be getting the Universal Audio LA-2A, it also comes with the older LA-2, which is a much more straightforward control set right here. We don't get the limiter comp or anything like that, and it has a different sound to it for sure. This has a really fantastic saturation right around 100 Hertz that I think is great for the tone of a bass. Now, the LA-2 is a much slower compressor. Overall, I think it's too slow for anything where the notes are moving this fast, but if we have something where there's more space between the notes, then this might be the perfect compressor here. It really just depends on what you want. And of course, we get a third option, which is the LA-2A Gray, and this is going to give us a slightly slower attack and slightly faster sounding release, at least to my ear. So it's a slightly different action, and it also has a little bit more of that warm and fuzzy thing going on, kind of more like the LA-2A. So it sort of sits between the LA-2A Silver and LA-2, just like kind of the color the faceplate implies, which is nice. Quite frankly, that might be the sound. I'm pretty happy with all of these, to be honest. Let's go back to this one real quick. You know what? I think this is the right combination of brightness and forwardness with that vintagey tone. I think we got it right here. This is the one. Cool. I'm just going off of feel here. There's no science to what makes something best. At the end of the day, this is all music, and that's what makes the LA-2A so great. It's really something where you listen to it musically and just feel it out. All right, let's pop on over to the vocal here.
Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood. Yeah. All of a sudden I'm seeing in color, seeing one another, sister and brother, fathers and mother. Humanity is no longer undercover, a spiritual push.
So the vocal is really well performed, but I would say the sound of it is a little bit bland. Let's see how far we can get with our LA-2A on the vocal here. So the vocal, we're going to go for kind of the same idea.
Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood. Yeah. All of a sudden I'm seeing in color, seeing one another, sister and brother, fathers and mother. Humanity is no longer undercover, a spiritual push.
So right away, the vocal wakes right up. You can see that my peak reduction is much higher. That's because my vocal is much quieter on input, but the amount of gain reduction, I started in that same range, that -2 to -5 kind of zone. So good default, it certainly worked. Now remember, there is a tilt to the sidechain, so there is this interesting way of the LA-2A making the source that it's on sometimes seem a little bit brighter, which is what I think is happening here. If we listen to the sibilants, you'll notice that the S's and T's are starting to poke out quite a bit.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood. Yeah.
I mean, it's actually not bad, but it is maybe a little bright for the record. If I wanted to warm it up, I can use a very similar technique where I pull a little bit of the lows out of the sidechain and hit the compressor a little harder, and this will start to function almost like a de-esser, where the sibilance tones will start to get controlled a little bit more.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood. Yeah. All of a sudden I'm seeing in color, seeing one another, sister and brother, fathers and mother. Humanity.
And I love that. I think that that sounds really great. I've done a lot of the quote-unquote EQing just by changing the detector circuit here and taking out some of the lows. It feels like it sits a little bit more in the upper mids and the middle mids than the brighter parts, and that works for this record pretty well. Now, let's jump back over here. Let's switch into limit mode. Limit mode is basically just another way of saying we're going to start with the signal a little bit more blended with the compressed feed. I'm going to get into the details of how that works in the second section of this video, but essentially we're just applying a heavier curve of gain reduction.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand. I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand.
So I don't typically like to use limit mode on too many sources. Sometimes it can be very interesting on drums and very heavily percussive material because you can get some pretty wild results. Generally speaking, I prefer the comp mode because I feel like it breathes a little bit better. Not breathes in the artifact sense, but breathes in the musical sense. And I feel like that's doing the job here. So my settings for this vocal is going to be comp with some of the lows taken out of the vocal and the peak reduction pushed a little bit harder. Just for fun, let's pull on the LA Gray with the same thing kind of going on here with some of the lows pulled out and a little bit more peak reduction. Just get a sense of how it feels.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood. Yeah. All of a sudden I'm seeing in color, seeing one another, sister and brother.
It's a slightly warmer sound. It's a slightly more limited sounding vocal, like the compression feels a little heavier in this, but I still like it. It still feels very good. Let's go back to the LA-2A Silver here.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood.
Now, I should also point out that here the VU meter is telling me that I'm actually doing more compression on the LA-2A Silver than I was doing on the Gray, but to my ear, I heard the compression and felt the compression more on the LA-2A gray. So we can't always go off of the VU meter. We really have to go off of our ears and our feel. And to me, the LA-2A gray here was feeling a little bit too heavy, in my opinion.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand.
But on a typical rap record, I actually might like that, because sometimes I like a slightly heavier feel on the compression. But here, I think the openness and the breath that's being provided is really preferable.
I don't know what's going on, feeling strong, feeling good. Things lining up like I hope they would. Don't need to understand what's understood, yeah. All of a sudden I'm seeing in color, seeing one another.
So these are some considerations when using the LA-2A. It is a little bit more tricky than it first appears, but the bottom line is ultimately it's a limited enough number of controls where you're basically just turning them until it feels right. And that, I think, is what really makes this particular hardware and also this particular plugin so desirable, is that you kind of turn off your logic brain and you just turn on your music brain and your feel and your vibe, and you turn the knobs and you get what you like. So I'm going to stick with these settings. I think they sound great. I don't think that the vocal or the upright bass really need a lot more in order to sound amazing. And now let's get into the technical specs of the LA-2A. Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be digging deep into the LA-2A compressor. The LA-2A, of course, is one of the most famous and ubiquitous studio compressors of all time. You are probably somewhat familiar with it. There's about 1 million plugin versions of it, but I actually want to get into the hardware schematic and really start picking apart how it works. The inspiration for this video came from BradleyHD. He's a fantastic engineer and content creator. You can follow him on Instagram at BradleyHD, or you can follow him here on YouTube at Radium Records. I will put links to both of those in the description below. There's a lot of mythology and a lot of misconception around this compressor. I think even Universal Audio is getting some of it wrong. So I want to go through everything about the LA-2A inside and out and start really picking apart what is making this thing tick. So here I have pulled up something that probably nobody wants to see, and this is a schematic of an LA-2A. So I'm going to give you kind of an idea of what all of this stuff is. I think that it can be a little overwhelming to look at something like this because it's just so many different symbols. But once you've got kind of a feel for what's going on, it's actually not that complicated of a circuit. So basically our input is going to come in here. And we have two paths to go down. This thicker black line on coming off of terminal 10 here, that's ground. We're going to not worry about that. Instead, our signal flow here is going to come up to terminal 7, and it's going to go over across this resistor into this series resistor junction right here. So this is the first stop of our signal. Now right here, two things occur. The signal hits a voltage divider. When you have two resistors in series like this, it creates a voltage divider. The voltage divider is going to send our main signal through here, which is going to be affected by some variable resistors. The strength of the signal is going to change based on what the two resistors right below it are doing. And then the resultant strength of that is going to come out over here into this gain network. Once it gets into the gain network, now we're in makeup gain zone. So this is where the gain knob on the LA-2A is, and it's controlling a 12AX7 tube, which is where we're hanging out right now. Once we've decided how much voltage we really want to pump, how much current we really want to pump, it's going to come up over here, and we're going to end up going into this next tube stage. Now, this next tube stage is known as a cathode follower. The purpose of this tube stage is really more to condition the signal so that it's going to react better with the output stage. So it's not really a gain stage. I do think it incurs a little bit of gain, but not very much. More importantly, it's preparing the signal to leave the compressor. So we go out of the cathode follower, we finally get over to our output transformer, and then lastly, we out. Okay, so this is the main signal path right here. However, there is a second signal path. That second signal path is going to be the sidechain path. So right off of this voltage divider here, we're also going to get signal that comes down here and gets into this 12AX7, which can be controlled using the peak control. Basically, the threshold for the LA-2A is fixed, and you push the sidechain signal up into it to get more compression. That's how the peak reduction is working. So that's what this tube stage is right here. This is all just control voltage. It's all just telling the signal how hard it's going to hit the photo-optical cell. So we come up here, we go over here, then we get into the actual driver, which is the 6AQ5, that is going to push the photo-optical cell. This is going to be also used to help calibrate two units together. But this is the last stage of amplification before we get to the photo-optical cell. There is a lot of amplification before the photo-optical cell because you need a lot of current to drive the light bulb. You need very little voltage and a lot of current. So we're coming up, we're out here, we're tracing along. These do not actually touch. We're just kind of crossing underneath of each other. We get up here, and this is a light bulb. So once we hit this light bulb with our signal from the control voltage path, that's when things start getting fun. The light bulb, being a light bulb, starts emitting light. Wait, that's not how that works. Let's draw a bunch of these. Nailed it. Nailed it. That's light. Okay, so it's emitting light. As these two photosensitive resistors start lighting up, resistance starts going down. So they start to act as a drain. As resistance starts going down, more of this primary signal here can now filter off to ground. So we start losing signal. Effectively, it's like this is the water pipe, but as resistance here starts going down, it's like little tiny holes get poked in the bottom of the water pipe. So some of the water pressure gets lost because the flow starts going somewhere else, if that makes sense. So basically, as the light illuminates more, the photoresistors start resisting less, and we start losing signal to ground. And that is the way that the compression actually works. That is it in a nutshell. What Brad is suggesting is that when voltage here and current here comes through these tubes, if your signal is hot enough, because of the nonlinear transfer function of tubes, you start getting into the realm where the functionality of the transfer is no longer one-to-one, and you start actually rolling off. If that is the case, that means proportionate to signal level, less signal actually makes it to the photoresistor. If less signal is making it to the photoresistor, that means less gain reduction is being applied, and therefore the amount of gain reduction over time is less. Effectively, it slows down the attack. That is the theory. And I don't think that that's a bad theory. I think that there is certainly a legitimate logic to it. And also, I want to pull up here. If I pop over to this DIY company here, Brad cited this particular statement. The above-mentioned 6AQ5 tube supplies the necessary audio voltage to drive the electroluminescent panel in the T4 cell, which is actually responsible for the smooth compression character of the LA-2A. Now, this is a little bit of a strange, confusing statement, because when it says which is actually responsible for the smooth compression character, that could be referring to the 6AQ5 tube, which is supplying the audio voltage, or it could be referring to the T4 cell, which is what's actually doing the compression. Now, I think it could be interpreted either way, but certainly the point stands that we have tubes in the control voltage path, and we know that tubes have a nonlinear function at extremes. So I like the theory. The question is it going to hold up? Just because we have authoritative statements that seem to be suggesting that it holds up doesn't mean that it actually will. I'm under the impression that it will not. And here's my theory. Now, mind you, I could be wrong about this, and I want to make that perfectly clear. The whole point of this is to become to become interested in learning more and developing our skills on the engineering side and really investigating these things, because personally I think they're fascinating and I'm really making this video for me. So I hope you're enjoying it, but more importantly, I'm enjoying it. Yeah, that's right, I'm doing this one for me. So, tubes are very misunderstood. In general, when people picture the transfer function of a tube, they think of an S-curve, where tubes are very nonlinear when you have extremely low amperage and voltage, and also nonlinear when you have extremely high amperage and voltage. And this is true. However, the gradient of those S-curves, particularly on the high side, is actually pretty steep. The vast majority of a tube's function in the middle is all very, very linear. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they might be preferable in a preamp circuit or something like that, because the transfer is actually almost consistently close to 1-to-1 for the vast majority of its operating range. When we think of the more gradual curves in a tube, that's usually when we have series of tubes or some other highly effective amp circuits that cause the performance of the tube to change. And the place we see that most often is actually guitar amps. This is not a guitar amp, but in a guitar amp you will see a more gradual gradient, and that's why as you start pushing hotter and hotter, you start getting all those lovely second harmonics. Here in a standard tube configuration, you will actually not get a lot of those harmonics from the tube. You will not get a lot of nonlinearities until you get to the very, very top of the headroom, and then you're going to start getting very close to clipping. You're going to have a little bit of a soft clip range where you will get some of those harmonics, but you're going to start squaring off pretty quick. That is the actual performance of tubes. Now, in terms of how much headroom we have here at the 6AQ5, we have about 100 volts of headroom. Generally speaking, we try to stay about in the middle of that because we want to stay away from the low end where things can get nonlinear and the high end where things get nonlinear. So there's going to be control voltage that's coming into the 6AQ5, and that's going to put us somewhere in the middle of the operating range. So if the signal gets quiet or the signal gets loud, we're still staying well within that linear performance range. Now, that's not to say that a stray snare hit couldn't get very, very close to that clipping zone or even into that clipping zone. But the question is, how much signal will we actually need to see? Well, we can figure this out by going off of our nominal operating levels. If we say that 0 dBVU calibrates to 1.228 volts, let's just call it 1.2 for simplicity's sake, and we have a 10-to-1 step-up transformer right here, that means that if we're going through nominal operating level, that is, we're hitting the meter at 0 on the VU, on like our console or whatever it is, you know, right before we get into that red zone that goes up to +6, we're coming in at 0. Well, that means that we're going to have 12 volts moving across this signal. Now, this stuff is going to get amplified and then unamplified and then changed, so I don't really know what the incoming voltage is here. But all I know is that if we were to take that nominal 12 volt signal without something else that's seriously upping the voltage, we would need to be hitting something like, if we have 50 volts in either direction, we would need to be going plus 12 to even 12 plus like plus 18. We'd have to be plus 18 on the dBVU meter in order to get into that clipping zone, in which case we're already clipping. So yes, we are going to certainly get performance issues because we are sending a clipped signal. We're probably clipping the transformer. We're probably clipping in other places. It's not going to sound good no matter what. So while that might actually change the action of the photo-optical cell, I think we have other problems. If we're working within our nominal operating range, we still have plenty of headroom in both directions to not get into that nonlinear zone. Now, this is all based off of the assumption that this section here, this 12AX7 and these resistors are all calibrated so that we're hitting the middle of the 6AQ5A range. That would be a typical configuration. That might not be the case, in which case we might end up not having as much headroom as I'm saying right now, and I want that to be very clear. But I think we probably are calibrated correctly for the standard performance of the tube. It becomes very easy to misunderstand how these things are happening, particularly because even the authorities on the subject can sometimes be wrong about it. And I'm going to give you a really, really weird and interesting example right now. This is going to be from Universal Audio. If I go into the Universal Audio Manual for the LA-2A, I'm going to say this, I think it's wrong. When it describes the sidechain circuit, which is where that blue line was, it says the previously described gain reduction circuit is controlled by control voltage, which is supplied by the sidechain circuit. True. The LA-2A is a feedback style compressor. This is due to the fact that the signal that is used to drive the sidechain circuit is affected by the gain-reduced signal. Now, I don't think that's correct. Or, if it is correct, it is a very different use of the word feedback compression than what we typically use today. So, I'm going to jump over here. This is the best diagram that I found for it. It's very, very simple, but here is a feed-forward design. We have our input, and then there is a junction, some kind of a divider, where the input signal goes to the compression and then out, while the input of the detector happens before it gets to the compressor. So it goes down the side chain, completely separate to whatever's happening in the VCA. That is feed-forward. Most early compressors were feed-forward in design. A feedback processor is very, very interesting. The signal goes into the compressor before it gets to the detector, and then the signal afterwards has the tap. So after the compression is where the signal then gets sent to the detector and back in. So the compressor is recompressing the compressed signal in a feedback style compressor. Now let's pop back to our diagram here. Our junction is right here. Let's give this a nice green circle, right? Because we want to see this real clear. Our junction is right here. This is the voltage divider where things split. This, right afterwards, this is where the compression is taking place. There is no place in this diagram. In fact, I can actually get rid of all of this stuff here. Let's get rid of all this, get rid of all this, get rid of all this. Should have kept my light on there because that was so artistic. But let's revisit this here. Okay? This right here is our voltage divider. Okay? This is where the compression is happening. Let's go back over to red here. This is where the compression is happening. So the signal here is being affected by the compressor right here. And that signal then goes to the makeup gain. At no point does anything from here, any live signal from here, ever go back to the side chain. Now, you might be saying, well, what about this thing, right? Could it be possible that it's actually doing this into the side chain? No. This is the B+ rail. This is just simply taking the power from the wall and making sure that these tubes are fed the power that they need. This is not connected to the actual signal path here. The signal path here simply goes into the cathode follower, into the output. No point does this signal, which has been compressed, ever have a way of getting back in to here. So that's pretty important. Now, the voltage divider is before the compression. It's taking input. It's in fact directly, it almost looks exactly like that block diagram that we just looked at, right? The signal comes in here, it gets to this junction, and it divides off to the sidechain. So it is the raw input signal after the step-up transformer that the sidechain is seeing at the 12AX7, right there. So maybe somebody can explain this to me, because maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see a universe where this is a feedback style compressor in any way. Maybe it's a different use of the lingo, but it's not. Now, let's talk about some of the other interesting things that are going on with the LA-2A, because there's a lot of fun stuff that happens here. So we have all sorts of cool things that we can do, right? We have the photo-optical cell, which can be controlled by this resistor here. We've got the limit and comp switch. When the limit switch is in, this little path right here is broken. And so the limiter has to go across the resistor, and therefore the signal is getting reduced. Mind you, the signal that is going down the other side of the voltage divider is not being reduced. So the original signal here is controlling the lamp. So we're still going to get plenty of reduction, but the actual signal that's being pulled on here, well, that's being reduced. The voltage is already being cut. So proportionately, the pull down ends up being a lot more. And the end result is something that instead of having a gain reduction curve that kind of looks like this, we have a gain reduction curve that kind of looks more like this. Much steeper. So that's nifty. That said, I prefer it in comp mode most of the time. When we get over here, we also have some fun little calibration things that we can use. We have our R37 frequency emphasis, which can pull more low end out of the sidechain and focus it more on top end, which can be nice if we want to, say, tame down or warm up a really sibilant vocal, or we're working on material that has like very icy tones, maybe we want to soften the attack of an upright bass or something like that. Or perhaps we're working on something like we're compressing a kick drum or an upright bass or a bass guitar, and we just want to let the low end breathe a little bit more. That might be a good way to do it as well. So we have that nice little sidechain filter in a sort of secret location. It's actually, you need a flathead screwdriver to turn it on the original LA-2A. So it's kind of like a little secret weapon kind of sauce here. And then there's also another screw here, this R3 stereo adjuster. Now the main purpose of this is to make sure that if you have two units that are working in conjunction, that this is going to be receiving the correct amount of voltage for them to both operate the same amount. So because every unit is going to be a little bit different, they're all going to have slightly different reactivities. You might send the same signal into two LA-2As and get slightly different amounts of peak reduction. So you can use this to help fine-tune the amount of peak reduction that's going to occur in one LA-2A, just so that you can even it out, and that gives you a stereo compressor for your LA-2As. If you've got two LA-2As, good on you. You've got about 25 grand worth of compression right there. Rock on. In addition, this can also be used to fine-tune the amount of voltage that's going into the 6AQ5, so it works kind of like just a basic resistor. So, if for whatever reason you need another way to modify things and the peak reduction thing is not, I wouldn't use it for that purpose. Really, the peak reduction is the better place to get less voltage into this particular tube. So cool stuff on that. And then lastly, of course, we're not only using this makeup gain for makeup gain, we are using this for the color of the signal. We have gain that is feeding into a transformer. Anytime you have that kind of configuration, which is pretty often, the more gain you get, the more harmonics you will get as well. This cathode follower does mitigate some of that. It's going to smooth things out to a certain degree, but overall, you still will be able to get a little bit more juice when you have your makeup gain feeding into your transformer almost directly here. Action for the LA-2A, it's a gradual attack at first, and then it speeds up as more and more gain reduction is applied. So this allows for the preservation of transients, but at louder signals, you end up getting a little bit more swing. So it's a very reactive, kind of intelligent program-dependent compression, which is why it sounds so musical. It also reacts slightly differently to different frequencies in terms of its attack and release time. I believe it's slightly slower on low frequencies than it is on high frequencies. I think that covers it. I think this is a good place where I can save myself to say if there's any questions about the LA-2A, you can certainly drop them in the comments section, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. Understand that electronics is not my forte here, so I might not be able to answer every question. I will do the best that I can, but if my answer is I'm not sure, don't hold it against me. And yeah, otherwise, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. Oh, actually, one other thing. If you want to dig into the more artistic and creative side of compression, this is all the very technical stuff here, but if you want to dig into the artistic and creative use of compression, I have the perfect video for you. It is Mixing with Compression. It is the best tutorial in the universe of all time on compression. That may or may not be true, but it's up there. And that is for sale on Weiss Advice. I will have a link to that in the description below. And now we can close out. Lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.